Hello sewing friends and welcome back. I'm the Cat Sews and recently I've made two different skirts that I wanted to share with you all. These skirts were made using the pencil skirt pattern in Gertie's Ultimate Dress Book. It was very easy to turn them into separates with just the addition of a waistband, and I also added pockets to one of them. So I made these two skirts using remnants from my fabric stash. One was made with the tartan fabric. I actually made a tartan dress about a year and a half ago, long before the introduction of my Instagram or this YouTube channel. It was one of my first big actually wearable projects and I made a bunch of mistakes, but I still love it. It holds a very special place in my heart. But I did buy additional fabric because I wasn't entirely certain if I cut fabric slightly different than the cutting layout said to, if I would have enough. As it turns out, of course, when you get a recommended fabric amount, you can generally buy a little bit less than that, because if you cut your fabric out more economically, you will end up with a bit extra. So with the extra I bought on top of that, I ended up with probably about half a meter, maybe 3/4 of a meter of fabric that I could use, and that has just been sitting in my stash. I've been meaning to turn it into a skirt for a really long time. I just wasn't sure what pattern or what type of skirt I wanted to go with, and finally I figured it out and I've made that. That is a really basic pencil skirt pattern that's just been shortened, so the making of isn't featured in this video, but I will show you the outcome. The other skirt that I made was actually made with this really beautiful mustard fabric from Nerida Hansen, which I adore. Nerida Hansen, I believe is an Australian brand. They do a lot of Australian prints. They also do a lot of Snugglepot and Cuddle Pie prints, depending on who the designer is, and they work with quite a few designers, so there's generally different styles depending on your personal taste, which is really fantastic. They also do remnant sales every so often. So they'll either sell individual remnant pieces or they'll sell them in packs. And I bought a pack. I ended up with about 5 or 6 different patterns and different fabrics to use. They were all from the same collection, but they're all slightly different materials. They're really beautiful. And I ended up with this mustard floral print that I really adore. Mustard is one of those colours that I personally look at and I think, I can't wear that. It's not going to suit me as an individual. It's going to be a bit of a disaster. But I see it on other people and it always looks really beautiful. I think I also read somewhere a long time ago that blondes can't really wear yellow tones, which, you know, is a bunch of nonsense. You can wear whatever you like. And that's always kind of stuck with me, so I figured I will experiment with it. I figure if it's a skirt, it's a bit more versatile if the colour doesn't like suit me personally, because it's a bit further away from my face and my hair, so it won't clash as much. That's the idea. We'll see how we go. Now, because I decided to set pockets in this, I didn't do a traditional inseam pocket because I tried it with my tartan skirt and it just made the hips a bit bulky, which I didn't want. So I decided to try out some slide pockets, which I'm going to show you how I did that. It was a bit different for me. I was really proud with how it turned out because it's the first time I've really... Sorry, that was my cat jumping up onto a chair. It's the first time I've really adjusted a pattern like that, and it turned out really well, so I'm exceptionally pleased. Unfortunately, because they are slide pockets, I would have had just enough of this fabric to make a basic skirt, but the addition of pockets meant that I didn't have enough. And slide pockets, you can see the back of the pocket from the outside. They're not hidden away like inseam pockets are. So I did them in a contrasting fabric, which I think has turned out really lovely. I'm going to take you through the process of putting in slide pockets and adjusting your pattern and creating the pocket. I'm not going to take you through how I graded out my patterns or anything like that, simply because I feel like I still have a lot to learn when it comes to grading patterns, and it's a personal journey anyway, so I don't think that people would gain so much from me grading out the pattern, but I did want to show you the pocket process. So if you're interested in continuing watching, then I'm going to take you through the process of making these two skirts. Enjoy! So once you've figured out your skirt pattern, make a copy of the front piece and along the side panel, trace out the general shape of the pocket you want. This is just a bit of a curved line. It doesn't have to be super deep in because you just basically have to fit your hand into it. I will note, please take a copy of your skirt pattern, and this is pretty vital for the next step. So as you can see, I've taken the original front piece of my skirt and I've laid my new version on top of that so that I can trace out the back pocket piece, because the back pocket piece is now going to make up part of your side seam. So you need to know what the original shape should be. And then I'm just going in and tracing how deep and wide I want my pocket to be. Again, something to note is I didn't want my pocket to interfere with my darts, so I couldn't make it super wide, and I have left a bit of space just so I can create the darts and fold them to the side without it being visible. Now, something that I haven't shown here because I didn't realize that it needed to be done until later was adding some seam allowance. So you don't need to worry about it so much for the bottom of your pocket. Just make it as wide and as deep as you would like it, as I've mentioned before. But wherever it attaches to the skirt, you will need some seam allowance. So at the top and along the side seam. It might seem like it will fit perfectly now, but I can assure you, you're going to need seam allowance. So please don't forget to add that. You'll figure it out once you start trying to sew it anyway. So once again, always recommending a mock-up. You'll also notice there's quite a bit of layering that goes into developing this slide pocket pattern. So what I'm doing now is I've taken my back pocket piece and I've laid it underneath my cutout pencil skirt pattern. So now I can go and trace through the inner pocket piece, get that curve and also how deep it needs to be. Once again, I didn't add seam allowance until much later. Well, I did. Okay, no, I'm wrong. Here we go. I'm adding some seam allowance here, but just to that inner curve, you also still need to add it to the top and the bottom of this pattern piece. Once again, it's very, very strange. It seems like it'll fit perfectly into your pocket now with no need for seam allowance, but once you try and go and sew it, all of a sudden you find that it's much smaller than it should be. So definitely, please don't forget that seam allowance like I did. I'm sorry I didn't show it here, but I'm sure you'll forgive me. So once that's done, we can actually move on to cutting out our pattern pieces. So I'm just going to take a minute to absolutely declare my love for the cutting mat and the rotary cutter. I will say, if you're a clumsy person, much like me, a rotary cutter is not always your best option, particularly because they can be a bit accident prone, but I really, really love them. When I'm sewing, I actually shouldn't be on my knees for so long, and I currently don't have a table big enough to cut out on. So a rotary cutter and a mat have really cut down the amount of time I need to be on my knees. It's just much faster to go through and cut everything. But I know some people love their scissors. I find that a rotary cutter means I can get a much cleaner cut and that my pieces are a little bit more consistent. But of course, you can cut out with whatever you find best. I just wanted to say, if you haven't tried a rotary cutter, I do highly recommend it. So here I'm just cutting out my waistband. This actually didn't turn out as wide as I wanted it because I really only had scraps left by the time I got my skirt cut out, but that's okay because it actually turned out a little bit longer than I wanted it to be. So when I cut off the bottom of my skirt to make it a bit shorter, I stole some of that fabric and used it to create my waistband, which I believe I might show you a bit later on. And then of course I have my lovely contrasting fabric for my pockets. This is by the same company, Nerida Hansen, and I believe it's the same collection as well. So some of the pink tones did actually match, which I was pretty pleased with, and I think it turned out really well. I will also note here that I did actually cut out a lining as well, which you'll see in due course. I just didn't film it here because I figured you've seen me cut out one lot of fabric. You probably don't need to see me cut out another. So moving on to the making of the skirt, we're going to start with our darts, and I have some tips and tricks for you because again, my table space is quite limited, so I do most of my work on my ironing board. So all I've done is I'm putting a piece of paper under my fabric, which is going to make it a bit easier for me to trace darts. It just means the pencil marks down a lot better. And then what I'm doing is I'm laying my pattern over my fabric and using a ruler to line up along the dart line and then just fold my pattern back. I find that this for me is the easiest method. I know that people go through, draw dots and then connect them. That works really well for some people. This is just what works best for me. And then I'm going through and I'm going to pin my darts. And again, I have a quick tip for this. What I'm doing is I'm putting my pin along the dart line and then I'm flipping the fabric over to make sure it's matching the dart line on the other side, because I do find that sometimes it can be a bit tricky to get your darts symmetrical. And then just sewing them down. I find for me it is easier to start at the top of the dart at the apex point and work my way down towards the edge of the fabric. I know that people often like to do this in the opposite way. This is what makes sense to me. And once I'm done sewing, I tie off the ends of the thread at the base of my dart. I don't do it for the top, but I always make sure to do it for the base, just so nothing comes loose and goes weird. I still do a back stitch there, which I know not a lot of people do. Again, it's what makes sense to me, and I find that it's not too difficult. And then when I go to iron my darts down, for the front, I always iron them away from the center. So for the front, I iron them towards the side seams, but for the back, I iron them towards the zipper. Then once the darts are all sewn and pressed, you can overlock everything, making sure that the darts are kept down and smooth the entire time. The only thing I didn't overlock was the inner edge of that pocket, as the seam allowance is going to be trimmed down and top stitched anyway. So now let's complete that front skirt panel so you can actually sew it to the back panels. The first thing I'm doing is attaching the inner portion of the pocket, taking care to match up the curve of the seam instead of worrying about the edges so much. I did find that with my added seam allowance, they overlapped a tiny bit, not a lot. So I think the seam allowance was fine, but definitely match up that inner curve. And then go ahead and sew it down. I should note here that in accordance with my pattern, I am sewing everything down with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. That's pretty standard for me. It's what I'm used to. However, if you're making a skirt with less or more seam allowance, adjust your pocket seam allowance and how you stitch them down accordingly. And then the next step is just trimming down the seam allowance. I do recommend doing this or clipping the curve, because you're going to now flip it to the wrong side of your fabric, and you want it to be able to move easily. So you can trim it down or clip the curve or do both. So yeah, here I am just turning it around to the wrong side of my skirt, and I'm going to give it a really good press. And from there, we're just going to top stitch it to make sure it stays in place and doesn't flip to the other side. It's totally up to you. I have just made sure that it sits slightly to the inside of my skirt, just to make sure it doesn't peek out, but you can definitely actually leave a little bit peeking out if you would like. And then, yeah, as you can see, I'm just top stitching it. Again, you can do this in a decorative way with a contrasting thread if you wanted, particularly because I have contrasting fabric, at least. I could have done this with a contrasting dark blue thread. I didn't. I kept it mustard because I didn't think about that. I really need to think about top stitching decoratively more often because I find that I neglect that. And now what I'm doing is I'm attaching the back piece of my skirt pocket to the inner curve of that original front piece. So I'm not really attaching it to the skirt yet, I'm just attaching it to the front piece of the pocket, and then we're going to sew those together. This is a bit like sewing the seam of an inseam skirt pocket, so actually separate the pocket from your skirt when you go to sew around the base and the inside of it. Basically here you're enclosing the pocket, and don't worry, we're going to enclose the side of the pocket as well when we sew it to our skirt. Hopefully this is quite clear for you and makes sense. I think I got a bit of a better camera angle this time around, so hopefully this is fairly straightforward to do. Then once you've got the pocket pieces joined together, now I'm going to sew the back pocket piece onto my skirt to make it stay in place and make sure it makes up the part of the seams that it should. So right now I'm just attaching that top piece to my skirt where they overlap, and I'm sewing them at 1/4 inch just so that that stitching won't be visible when I put in my waistband or sew up the side seams of my skirt. And once again, I'm doing the same thing along the side. I'm just attaching that side of the pocket to the side of my skirt. And this is also going to close off that side of the pocket. So now you have a fully enclosed pocket and it makes up the seams that it should. So you can see that top piece of the pocket poking out is just completing the top of the side seam of the front piece. And from here you can just attach your back skirt pieces and sew them up as regular side seams. Now you're done with your pocket, there's nothing to worry about anymore. So what I'm doing is I'm matching up the top of the waist of each of my pieces and pinning downwards. I find it easier to adjust the hem than to adjust the waist, and you don't want your darts to get out of whack, so I find it's much better to match up the waist first and work your way down. Something else I have heard from Gretchen Hirsch is when you're sewing to start from the bottom of your hem and work your way up towards the waist. To be perfectly honest, I don't know why this is, but you know, she's an expert, she's been doing this for a long time, and that is her recommendation, so that's what I do. And then I just sew them up as regular seams. I'm also just showing you a very quick reminder that I have actually cut out a lining and I've been sewing it along the main outer skirt this entire time. So I'm up to the exact same steps across both. I will note with the lining, obviously you don't need to create pockets for that. So I used my original skirt pieces to cut those out, and I'm just sewing it as a regular pencil skirt without the need for pockets. This is also partially why I did slide pockets, because I figured they would be the easiest pocket to create with the addition of a lining and not worry about the lining interfering with your pocket use, because you don't want it to be constricted if you've actually gone through the effort of adding pockets to your skirt. And of course, a quick reminder that once your side seams are sewn up, to press everything flat from the inside and the outside, and then you can go ahead with putting in your zipper and sewing up the back pieces. So to start off with, I'm going to measure the length of my zipper down from the top of my skirt and put a pin there. This is going to mark where I want to stop stitching my back seam. Now, generally on most patterns, this will already be marked for you and you will be told what zipper to buy. But if you change the length of your zipper, for instance, if you're a bit like me and you have wider hips, a longer zipper can actually help get the skirt over your hips a bit better. So I tend to buy something that's about an inch or so longer than my recommendation. And then from there, I'm just sewing up the back seam. So I'm inserting a lapped zipper here, but you can insert whatever kind of zipper you feel most comfortable with. Generally speaking, you can exchange lapped zippers or invisible zippers as you please. You just need to be aware of the seam allowance when you're doing it. So my technique of inserting a lap zipper here does call for a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. For my lining, I'm just pressing down the back seam as usual, and when I come to the top open zipper portion, I'm pressing both sides down by 5/8 of an inch because I'm just going to hand sew these in later. But for the outer layer of my skirt, I'm going to do it a bit differently. So first you have to pick the underlap side, which is the side that's going to sit directly next to the zipper teeth. It doesn't actually matter which side is the underlap side, but when I look at the outside of my garment, right sides out, I pick the right hand side of my zipper opening, and then I'm going to press that down by 1/2 an inch. And then with the overlap side, this is going to cover the top of my zipper. I'm going to press that down by the regular 5/8 of an inch. And then I'm going to move to my sewing machine. So I'm going to line up the top of my fabric with the top of my zip. Something that no one ever pointed out to me and took me a while to figure out was actually not ever to cut the ends of your zipper off. They don't need to, and you don't need to, and in this case, our waistband is actually going to cover up those ends. And as I go down, I'm lining up the edge of my fabric with the edge of my zipper teeth, and I'm just sewing along with my zipper presser foot. You'll notice I started off with my zip separated, and I was just sewing on the right side of it. And when I got about halfway, I put the needle down, brought up my presser foot, and then zipped the zip closed. This just makes it easier when you get towards the bottom of the zipper to keep everything nice and straight. I do a quick back stitch along the bottom, and then I sew the other side. Now this one I do put a pin in just the beginning of this because it makes it a bit easier. I actually zip my zip closed and I line up the overlap of the fabric so that it covers my zip. I put a pin in that, I open up my zip again, and then I start sewing down. Again, lining up the top of my fabric with the top of my zipper and keeping a nice overlap as I sew. Particularly when you're beginning and if you don't have an eye for these things, it might be easier to put pins in this to make sure your overlap is consistent all the way through. I have actually inserted a bunch of these zips, and to be honest, I find pins a bit more fiddly than they're worth. But you just want to keep your fabric nice and straight as you're sewing down and make sure the whole way through that overlap is just covering the line of stitching on the underlap. So it should cover your entire zip and then just cover the line of stitching. Then when you get to the bottom, you're going to place your needle down and pivot the entire thing 90 degrees so you can sew directly across the end of the zipper. Please be careful of the metal end of your zipper during this process. You don't want to slam your needle down into it. And be careful of it as you go down as well. Something that I do, particularly when I get to the end of it, is I do actually just crank my hand wheel to sew through that portion, making sure to always turn forward though. So now I can insert my lining into my skirt. As you saw before, I pressed down my zipper opening for this as well, so that's already done. And I'm just going through, I've lined up again the zipper opening with the inside of my zipper teeth, if that makes sense. I hope so. And I'm just going through and lining up all of my seams and my darts, kind of acting as matching points so that nothing's off or fits weird. To be fair though, it doesn't matter super much because of course no one's really going to see the lining except for you, so don't stress too much about this step, particularly if things get pushed a bit out of place as you sew. Important to note is that I'm also matching wrong side to wrong side here, so all of the raw edges of your seams and your darts, they're actually going to be sandwiched together. So basically, if you turned your skirt inside out, it would look cleanly finished from that point as well. And then I'm just taking the edges of my waistband and I'm sewing them all together. I think I mentioned earlier, I actually didn't end up with a lot of fabric left. So once I went to hem my skirt, I actually stole a bit of the hem to add to my waistband, because otherwise my waistband was going to end up being a bit thinner than I wanted it to be. And now I'm just sewing up my outer and inner skirt pieces. So here again, I'm using 1/4 inch allowance because I want this line of stitching to be hidden by my waistband. You don't need to worry so much about the zipper teeth as you're doing this, because hopefully 1/4 inch you're still sewing along that very top fabric portion of your zipper. And I'm just going to go through and quickly baste these together. So once that's done, I'm going to take a bit of a break from the sewing machine and hand stitch the zipper opening on my lining closed. All I'm doing is lining up that edge again with my zipper, and I'm just doing a back stitch to join them together. And I'm being careful to just get the lining and the zip in these stitches, which is why I'm doing it by hand. I didn't actually want to cross over any of the outer stitching trying to do this. So just very quick and easy, that one. It didn't take long at all. And now we can move on to the waistband. So quick press of all of those side seams, just where things were joined up. And then I'm actually going to interface the inside of this because I do want it to be a bit more structured. I will note, obviously, you can see here, this isn't one long piece of interfacing. What someone very generously pointed out that I hadn't thought of before was that fusible interfacing doesn't need to be a big long piece. Certainly more complicated things, particularly bodice pieces, it's nice to be able to cut out the pattern for the interfacing, just because otherwise you would be there for a while. But particularly something like a waistband, it's quite easy to just kind of puzzle match this and go through and cut a bunch of weird pieces and fit them together. I find that this is relatively quick and easy to do, and it saves a lot of waste. And then I like to cover up my fusible interfacing and then press it down. It does take a bit longer this way, but of course you don't end up with glue on your iron, which I do feel is pretty important. And then we can attach the waistband. So I'm lining up the side seams of the waistband to the side seams of my skirt. And then I'm going to go ahead and sew it down, again at 5/8 inch. You might notice some discrepancies between what I've said and what I'm currently doing. For example, I'm not actually sewing at 5/8 inch currently. I sewed this waistband down originally trying to work with the fabric I initially had, and it did not work for me. So then I went and added fabric onto it after hemming my skirt, and then sewed it down at the 5/8 inch that it was supposed to be. So please do as I say and not as I'm currently doing, because what I'm currently doing didn't end up working, and then I didn't think to get footage of what I actually ended up doing, because I'm very smart. I'm sure you guys realize this already. So here we go. Now you can see I have actually added on that extra bit of fabric that I was mentioning, and I'm just giving that inner seam a really, really good press. And then I'm taking my waistband and I'm going to give the whole thing a really good press. So from the inside, I'm folding that seam I just sewed upwards, and I'm pressing all of that seam into the waistband. And then from the right side, I'm just pulling that waistband up, making sure to keep everything underneath really flat and smooth, and I'm pressing the whole thing a final time. And then to finish prepping my waistband, I'm going to fold the raw edge inwards by its seam allowance and give it a good press all the way along. Then I'm going to fold the entire waistband in half so that the free edge just covers the line of stitching from when I originally sewed the waistband down. That way, when I stitch in the ditch to sew the inner portion of it in, it'll just catch that free edge as I go through. You can also hand sew this. I do recommend pinning this as you go through so that it actually stays in place when you sew it, because there's quite a lot of fabric under that presser foot now. You might find that the under layers of fabric don't quite keep up with the top layers, and things get moved a bit out of proportion if you don't give them a press. Then I'm just trimming down my waistband to the length that I want it. I do want there to be a bit of an overlap because I'm going to put a buttonhole and a button in here. And then I'm actually going on the inside and pressing the corners down so that I can fold it in and just sew the entire outside of the waistband together. You can also do this another way. Once that raw edge is pressed down, you can put the right sides of the waistband together and then sew that very end seam, and then turn it around and sew the rest of the waistband shut. But I find that it does get a bit bulky at this point, particularly because I was dealing with so many layers of thick cotton. So this was the way I chose to do it. And then I'm just going through and sewing that inner edge of the waistband down. You'll see that I'm working from the outside because I'm going to stitch in the ditch to do this. So basically I'm stitching in that seam line where the waistband meets the skirt from the front side. And this way my stitching will be invisible from the outside. Is the plan, hopefully. So you'll notice as I'm going through, I am definitely taking my time with this one. It's one you want to go very slowly with and make sure that you're really getting into that line. And I'm pulling both the skirt and the waistband taut just to make sure that everything lies really flat. And if you do stretch things out a little bit, it will make it easier for you to get in that line when you're stitching. As I said, you could also just whip stitch it down from the inside, so you don't have to do this method at all. It just depends on what works best for you. That did actually take me quite a bit of time to do, so I won't make you watch all of it. And now I'm just finally putting on my button. I actually found the perfect shade of pink that went along well with the pink in the flowers on my skirt. Somewhere in my stash, I swear. See, this is why hoarding buttons is a good thing, really. Just hoard all of the possible sewing supplies, because one day you'll make a skirt with the exact same shade of pink as a random button that I can't remember where I got the button from. I also do save a lot of the spare buttons that come with clothing, which does come in handy. So to figure out the length of my buttonhole, I measure the length of my button, or the diameter of my button, and I just add 1/4 inch to it. Then I go along wherever I want the buttonhole, and I do essentially a Roman numeral number 1. So I mark both the endpoints very clearly. That way I can line them up really well with my presser foot. So I just take the first horizontal line and line it up with the very middle of my presser foot. And my machine has a 4-step buttonhole, and it moves backwards. So again, I did test my buttonhole function on this fabric, particularly because there were quite a few layers of fabric, which is also something to take into account. I did find that because I had quite a few layers, I possibly could have made my buttonhole a little bit bigger, because I did find that my button struggled to move through everything. Just something to keep in mind, and of course do your tests. Definitely be very confident with how your machine makes buttonholes. And then to finish up, I've put a pin at the end of my buttonhole, and now I'm going to use my seam ripper to go up and open it. So the pin's basically going to stop me ripping through those end stitches, but this was quite thick and a bit tricky to get through, so I only ended up getting about halfway before I just turned around. And I always like to snip some of the loose threads from the inside of the buttonhole. I find that they do build up, particularly with the seam ripper. Something else you can do to kind of prevent those loose threads is get some Fraylock. It's essentially a glue that you'll be able to find in most sewing supply stores, and just use that on the inner edges of your buttonhole. It does need a few days to dry, so it is definitely something that I wait till the end of a project to do, but I've found it that it's really, really handy for buttonholes. I've enjoyed using it quite a lot. The other method is to get a proper buttonhole opener that it looks like a chisel of sorts. I know a lot of people have them, but I don't. So I'm just using my handy old seam ripper for the meantime. Then to put my button in, so I line up my buttonhole with where I want my button to go, roughly, and I put a pin right through the middle of the buttonhole. And then I get rid of my left side, which currently has the buttonhole in it, and I use the pin as a guide to start putting in my button. Again, this is a shank button, which I find myself using quite a lot lately. So I can't do it with my machine, but I have found that just those little final bits of hand sewing have been quite nice to finish a project with. And to finish off, I'm just going to do my hems. So I am hemming my lining and my outer skirts separately. I haven't stitched them together. You could press down both seam allowances and then just sew the lining to the bottom edge of the skirt, if that is how you would like it. I do like my lining to be separate, so I haven't joined it up except for where it is joined at the waistband. The other alternative is that you don't actually have to hem your lining at all if you don't want to, because realistically this is your item of clothing and no one is ever going to see it. And once that's done, you're done. You have a fully functioning skirt and now you can wear it, which is excellent. Well done. As mentioned, I made 2 skirts based off the same pattern and I adore them. They are now solid staples in my wardrobe. So I hope you enjoyed. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed that. As always, leave comments for things you found helpful or valuable, or things you would like me to try differently. I always welcome feedback. You can also follow me on Instagram and share your makes with me there. I'd love to see them, and you can see me make things in much more real time than it takes me to upload a video. So happy sewing everyone, and have a wonderful day. Bye!